The first tooth arrived on a Sunday that already tasted of rust. A milk-white incisor balanced on the sill of the meeting-house window like a bead of chilled wax, its root tips still pink with the ghost of gum. And when Deacon Josiah Hale lifted it with trembling fingers, he felt the cold travel straight through the pulp of his own teeth, as though the Lord had driven a sliver of winter into the marrow of every soul gathered there. Outside, the wind carried the smell of bruised apples from abandoned orchards along the Wallkill, and the pale grass in the graveyard lay flattened in perfect rows, as if someone had combed it while the congregation sang the long meter psalm. No child had cried, no mother had gasped, no blood showed on any lip, yet the tooth was undeniably human, small enough to have belonged to a child of 6 or 7, and the deacon's mind went at once to the crooked headstones beyond the western wall where the earliest baptisms had been returned to earth before their 7th year. He closed his fist around the thing, felt the delicate crown press against the lifeline of his palm, and the sensation was precisely that of holding a minute skull still wearing its face. The second tooth came the following Sabbath, a broader, darker cuspid that carried the faint stench of soot, as though it had been coughed out of a chimney throat, and this time it balanced not on the sill, but on the narrow lip of the diamond pane itself, caught between the leaded cames like a leech that had tried to suck glass. Elder Abiah Verplanck, whose father had helped haul the ashlar for the original walls in 1759, declared that the pane had been exuding moisture all week, a slow bead of water threading downward each dawn, although no rain had fallen and the air was dry enough to split hymnals. By the time the congregation rose for the second reading, the bead had reached the lower rail and the tooth sat in it, rocking gently whenever the organ's windbox exhaled, so that the ivory seemed to nod in agreement with whatever invisible thing stared in from the burying ground. Women felt their own incisors ache, men tasted iron, and the minister's sermon on the patience of Job faltered twice while he listened to a sound that might have been a child sucking at an empty socket. The third tooth never reached the window at all. It was found instead in the communion chalice after the linen had been folded away, a molar crowned with a black plug of decay, swimming in a half-inch of diluted wine that still carried the faint impress of every lip that had drunk that morning. The elder who lifted the cup felt the tooth click against the silver like a dice in a gambler's box, and when he poured it out upon the frozen earth the red stain sank immediately, leaving a scar the shape of a child's open mouth. That night the frost came earlier than any veteran of the valley could recall, walking across the Wallkill on legs of still water, sealing the river rushes in sleeves of brittle glass so that they rang together like the thin bones of infants. Dogs would not leave their kennels, and in every farmhouse candles guttered though no door was opened, while overhead the Pleiades seemed to crowd so near that their blue fire scorched the edges of the moon. In the manse the minister's wife dreamed of a cradle fashioned from window leads, its sides bowed outward like a cage for moths, and inside it something rolled that was too heavy for cloth and too light for stone. When she woke, the imprint of the dream remained upon her tongue, a gritty sediment that tasted of chalk and char, and she spat into the slop jar 3 times, yet could not rid herself of the sense that she had swallowed a word she had never been meant to hear. By the 4th Sabbath, the meeting-house had begun to breathe with a mouth not its own. The great oaken beams, hand-hewn from the original forest that once stood where the graveyard now lay, exhaled a smell of sap turned sour, and the hinges of the west door wept a brownish oil that smelled curiously like the inside of a child's pocket. Lint, pebble, and the ghost of a peppermint dropped the previous winter. Mothers counted their offspring before the opening psalm, and counted them again after the final blessing, yet none were missing, none marked by blood or gap, yet every woman felt the hollowness beneath her breastbone grow more definite, as though a tiny fist had been clenched there and would never open. The minister, whose name was Obadiah Crane, a man already hollowed by the memory of two stillborn sons, stood in the pulpit and watched the congregation as if from the far end of a tunnel carved through salt. Their faces appeared to him to be shrinking, the soft tissue drawing back from the jawline so that every smile resembled a death grin. And when he opened the great Bible, the pages cracked like thin ice, releasing a breath of cold air that smelled of wet parchment and the sweet rot of milk teeth kept overlong in a jar. He had intended to preach on the covenant of grace, but the words rearranged themselves upon his tongue until he heard himself describing instead the custom of certain alpine villages, where the bereaved planted a single deciduous tooth in a churchyard beam, so that the dead child might grow into the wall and be forever among the living. The elders glanced at one another, for none could recall such a passage in any accepted confession, yet the minister spoke with the calm certainty of a man reciting his own funeral sermon. After the blessing, when the people filed out between the high box pews, each worshiper paused involuntarily before the window in question. A narrow lancet of 12 quarries set in the south wall, and every one of them saw, though no two later agreed on the precise order, that the panes were no longer quite transparent. Something cloudy had begun to gather between the layers of glass, a faint precipitate that looked at first like breath frozen upon a mirror, but resolved itself, the longer stared at, into a pattern of small white shapes, ranked as evenly as seeds in a pod. They went away shaking, some crossing themselves though they were Dutch Reformed and scorned papist gesture, others murmuring scraps of psalms meant for leprosy and plague, and all agreed that the wind which met them on the threshold carried the smell of a nursery that had been shut since the previous century, the sour sweetness of linen yellowed by milk, and the sharper reek of lamp oil spilled upon a child's nightgown. That evening, the deacon walked out to the burying ground with a lantern, though he could not have said whether he went to look for a disturbed grave or to ask forgiveness of the dead. The frost had heaved the soil so that the stones leaned at angles that suggested listening, and between the slabs he saw the prints of small bare feet, 5-toed and absurdly delicate, leading from the door of the meeting-house to the plot where the earliest children lay beneath slabs carved with winged skulls whose own teeth were bitten deep into the lower lip of stone. He knelt, lantern creaking, and touched one print. The earth was hard as December, but the shape was perfect, even to the faint ridge left by the nail of the great toe, and when he held his own hand above it he felt a cold rise up that was not the cold of weather, but of flesh suddenly emptied of blood, the chill that belongs to amputated limbs and stillborn things. Behind him the meeting-house stood black against a moonless sky, its windows holes without depth, yet in the one offending pane he thought he saw a point of paler darkness shift, as though something inside the wall had turned over to accommodate a new weight. He remembered then what his grandfather had whispered once after too much Geneva gin, that when the Ulster refugees raised the first log chapel on this rise in 1759, they had mortised the beams with a mixture of clay and powdered bone, because the elders feared the Indians and believed that the dust of their own dead would make the walls unconquerable. The bone had come from the tiny coffins of a fever that passed through the ship from Rotterdam, children who never saw the New World, but whose remains were burned and ground so that the living might dwell in safety. The deacon rose, wiping his fingers upon his coat, and as he walked back down the hill, he felt something roll beneath the skin of his cheek, a shifting that was not quite pain, as if a tooth, long-rooted, had decided to loosen itself at last and go traveling. When he closed his mouth, the occlusion was different, the subtle misalignment that follows extraction, and he knew with a certainty that tasted of iron that the meeting house was not done collecting its tithe. The valley in which the meeting house stood had been purchased from the Aesopus Sachem 2 lifetimes earlier by a company of Dutch-speaking folk who carried Bibles printed in Geneva and an iron strongbox lined with cedar, the latter containing the subscription list of a Rotterdam church whose walls had never been built because the plague had arrived first. They had come upriver in an overloaded sloop, women and children hidden below hatches that smelled of rye mash and wet flax, while above them the men watched the Catskill ridges rise like the blackened spine of some antediluvian creature whose vertebrae had been fractured by the weight of its own memory. By the time they reached the flats where the Wallkill makes its slow, serpentine apology for the violence of the Shawangunk escarpment, half the children were coughing blood bright as the scarlet berries of the mountain ash, and the company voted to burn the bodies rather than surrender them to the soil of a land not yet their own. The ashes were collected in the same iron box that had carried the subscription money, and when the first log chapel was raised, those ashes were mingled with the clay daub, because the elders believed that a wall which contained its own dead would never be taken by strangers. The structure lasted 21 years, until a spark from the chimney of a wedding supper leapt across the darkness and licked the daub away, revealing within the charred outlines of small ribs and the perfect globe of a child's skull, blackened but intact, so that when the new stone meeting house was planned in 1759, the congregation resolved to bury what remained beneath the southeast corner, where the sun would warm the stones at midday and the shadow of the pulpit would never fall. They laid the foundation in the season of apples, mixing the mortar with creek water and the salt of their own sweat. But on the night after the cornerstone was set, a storm came down from the north that had not been heralded by any barometric throbbing or the customary ache in the joints of the old. Lightning struck the fresh masonry, splitting the granite so that a seam opened shoulder-wide, and from it the workmen drew out a tooth, a second molar still wet with blood that could not have belonged to any creature buried a century earlier. The elders debated whether to halt construction, but winter was already sharpening its teeth upon the ridges, and the people needed a place to huddle against the long darkness that came down so abruptly after the short day. They reset the stone, this time interleaving it with a course of cedar shingles carved from the same tree that had shaded the first funeral, and upon the shingles they inscribed, in the Old Dutch, the words, "Here rust het kind dat geen naam meer heeft. Here rests the child that has no longer a name." No one spoke of the incident afterward, at least not above a whisper, and when the building was completed the following spring, the minister preached a sermon on the patience of Job, though the text he chose was from the apocryphal Wisdom of Solomon. For the hope of an unfruitful man wavereth like a pillar set in the wall, and the comfort of a childless house falleth to the ground. The congregation sang the psalm to the long meter tune known as Windham, whose descending minor third seemed to echo the sound of something falling down a well, and afterward they filed out beneath the new beams that smelled of pine and stone dust, each member pausing to touch the southeast corner as if to reassure themselves that the earth had accepted what had been given. But the earth is a miserly banker, and it pays back its deposits with usurious interest compounded in the currency of nightmare. In the decades that followed, the valley prospered, if prosperity can be measured by the number of cider presses that do not break, by the regularity with which the ice on the mill pond thickens enough to bear the weight of a loaded sled, and by the gradual replacement of hand-hewn beams with sawn lumber that smells of fresh money rather than of ancestral sweat. Yet every generation produced one child who could not or would not speak, a boy or girl who walked at dusk to the meeting house and pressed an ear against the southeast wall, listening for the cadence of a heart that beat beneath the foundations with the slow patience of tide or of a pregnancy that refuses to end. These children were not punished because their parents feared that any discipline might break something already cracked, and instead they were given tasks that kept them far from the building, herding geese to the distant pond, gathering chestnuts beyond the ridge where the old Esopus trail still shows as a scar through the hemlock. But distance offered no prophylaxis, and by the age of 9, each of these silent ones had lost at least one tooth in circumstances that could not be explained by any collision with apple tree branch or the heel of an older brother's boot. The teeth were never found, though mothers searched the straw of the mattress, the cracks between floorboards, the gullets of the dogs, and when at last the child was laid out for burial, because the valley exacts its levy however it will, the embalming fluid was observed to cloud, as though a fine powder, the color of old piano keys, had been stirred into the alcohol, and the undertaker, a man who had seen every variety of human diminution, turned away with the taste of chalk rising at the back of his own throat. In 1837, when the canal at Newburgh opened and the first raft of Pennsylvania coal drifted down to float the valley's forges, the meeting house received a gift from the widow of a Hudson River squire whose only son had vanished while skating the previous winter. She sent, by 2 Irish laborers who refused to remain after nightfall, a stained glass window depicting the Good Shepherd, the lamb across his shoulders rendered in amber so translucent that when the sun struck it at the angle of vespers, the entire nave filled with the illusion of honey, and the faces of the worshippers appeared to melt into expressions of unbearable longing. The window was installed in the south wall, replacing the plain quarries that had admitted the light of common day, and for a season the congregation rejoiced that the countenance of the divine now looked in upon them with sapphire eyes. But the following autumn, when the widow herself was found sitting upright in her pew, with her mouth open and empty, every tooth drawn clean from its socket and arranged upon her lap in the shape of a shepherd's crook, the gift came to be regarded with a suspicion that bordered on loathing, and some proposed that the glass be smashed and the fragments buried at the 4 corners of the property, though this was never done because the expense of replacement could not be borne by a community still reeling from the panic. Instead, the window remained, and with each passing year the amber deepened to the color of cider that has begun to ferment toward vinegar, while the eyes of the painted Christ grew milky, as though cataracts of grief were forming upon them. Children who sat in the front row reported that the lamb appeared to gain weight from Sunday to Sunday, its haunches thickening until the Good Shepherd seemed to stagger beneath a burden no longer innocent, and one girl, the daughter of the blacksmith, declared that she had seen the lamb open its mouth and reveal, in place of the expected meek dentition, the double-fanged grin of a wolf pup. But she was 9 years old and given to tales, so her words were discounted, though her mother noted that night that the child's own second incisor hung by a thread of pink tissue that refused to sever, as though the root had grown into the bone of the jaw with the stubbornness of ivy clinging to a tomb. The Civil War passed over the valley like a wind that breaks the tops of trees but leaves the undergrowth strangely undisturbed. 23 boys marched away in boots stitched by their sisters, and 11 returned, most of them missing some portion of anatomy, an ear, 3 fingers, the power of speech. But the meeting house continued to stand, its beams seasoning in the smoke of funeral pyres that could not be seen from the ridge yet, whose odor drifted across the valley like the ghost of a lullaby whose words have been forgotten while the melody persists. And in 1864, when the minister climbed into the pulpit to announce the Emancipation Proclamation, he observed that the stained glass window had begun to sweat, a slow exudation of moisture that carried with it the faint but unmistakable sweetness of infant breath. And when he placed his hand upon the lectern, he felt the wood move, not with the ordinary respiration of timber adjusting to temperature, but with the deliberate expansion of something that has learned to inhale. What followed were the years of consolidation, when the railroad pushed through to Kingston and the valley's butter could ride to market in tin-lined cars that kept it cool even in August. Prosperity brought stained walnut pews to replace the scarred pine benches, and a new organ whose pipes were said to have been cast from the kettles carried by the original refugees, so that when the wind was wrong, the hymns emerged with a taste of rye and of exile. Yet beneath the varnish and the polished brass, the building continued its subterranean conversation with the deposit of ash and tooth and salt that had been entombed beneath its corner, and the sound of that conversation was not audible to the ear, but to the marrow, where it registered as a slow loosening, the way ice calves from a glacier in a season too early for thaw. By the time the century turned, the valley had learned to live with its unease the way a man learns to live with a limp, compensating by taking the longer path around the meadow where the ground is softer. But compensation is not cure, and in the winter of 1899, when the thermometer at the general store registered 20 below for 7 consecutive mornings, the meeting house began to emit a sound that could not be attributed to wind or to the contraction of frost-split timber. A click, soft as a knitting needle tapped against porcelain, that repeated at intervals of 40 heartbeats, and those who stood closest to the south wall swore that with each click the stained glass window brightened, as though a lamp were being turned up inside the lamb's amber flank, and the light that escaped was the color of milk teeth held to a candle. The minister who served the valley in that year was named Ephraim Slade, a man whose ancestry reached back to one of the original subscribers of 1759, though his line had diverged like a misset bone and had produced in each generation at least one apostate who fled westward rather than face the balance sheet of inherited guilt. Ephraim himself had returned from Ohio with a wife whose lungs were already half consumed by the white roses of tuberculosis, and with a theology that had been softened by contact with Universalists who preached that even the most wayward tooth might be restored to its original socket in the resurrection morning. He had not been present when the clicking began, having spent the worst of the cold snap at the bedside of a parishioner whose barn had burned with 3 children inside, and when he re-entered the meeting house on the first Sunday of February, he noticed at once that the air carried the metallic sweetness of a dentist's drill, though no dentist had practiced within 20 miles since the itinerant Frenchman had been driven out for attempting to extract a molar from the jaw of a girl who turned out to be not asleep, but cataleptic. The congregation rose to sing, "Abide with Me," but the hymn faltered because the organ's wind chest sucked instead of exhaled, and the sound that emerged was the slow wheeze of a lung learning to breathe backward. Ephraim ascended the pulpit with the sense that he was climbing into a mouth whose palate had been raised too high. The lectern felt warm, as though a child had been leaning there, and when he opened the Bible, the page split along the spine of Isaiah 30, releasing a confetti of what might have been dried petals, except that they rattled with the distinct timbre of enamel. He read about the day of the Lord coming as a thief in the night, but his voice cracked on the word teeth, though that word does not appear in the text, and afterward no one could recall what he had preached, only that the stained glass window behind him had begun to pulse like a throat swallowing something too large for passage. After the benediction, he remained alone, ostensibly to pray, but in truth to listen, because he had begun to suspect that the building was not haunted in the vulgar sense, but inhabited by a process, a slow chemistry of grief and mineral that had reached the stage of crystallization. He knelt upon the walnut rail, pressing his forehead against the wood until it grew slick with his sweat. And beneath the ordinary creak of cooling timber, he heard the minute grind of salt upon salt, the sound of a century's worth of tears evaporating into a deposit fine enough to abrade glass. When at last he lifted his head, the lamb in the window had turned its face away from the shepherd, and the amber flank now revealed a ridgeline that could only be interpreted as vertebrae, the spine of a creature that had never been herbivore. He felt his own canine shift, a sensation like a boat pulling gently at its mooring. And when he ran his tongue along the inner surface, the tooth came away clean, root and all, balanced on the tip as though presented for inspection. He spat it into his palm, carried it to the southeast corner, and pressed it into the hairline crack that had reopened since the morning frost, feeling the masonry accept the offering with the same polite suction that a well-bred mouth employs when receiving the wafer. The following week the temperature rose above freezing, the river cracked its ice like a whip, and the valley smelled of water that had been asleep too long. Yet the clicking continued, now accompanied by a softer sound, the intimate chink of porcelain spoon against porcelain cup, and those who arrived earliest for Wednesday prayer meeting swore that the air inside the nave was warmer than the air outside, as though the building were running a low fever, and the warmth carried with it the odor of a sick room, camphor, laundered lint, and beneath those the greenish sweetness of gums that bleed when the first permanent tooth forces its way into a mouth already crowded by memory. The elders convened in the deacon's house, a frame dwelling whose parlor smelled of apples stored too long, and of the deacon's mother, who had not left her bed since the death of her last daughter in childbirth, and who insisted on keeping the curtains drawn because the light hurt her teeth. They spoke in the low, practical tones of men who have mortgaged their fields and must now decide whether to plant wheat or corn upon the thin hope of weather. And what they decided was that the south window should be removed, the stained glass packed away in sawdust, and the aperture bricked up before Pentecost, because the congregation could not afford another scandal in a year when the price of butter had fallen below the cost of the tin required to ship it. The work was scheduled for the first Monday in April, but on the preceding Saturday night, a wind came out of the northwest that did not blow so much as whistle. A single note held for hours until every chimney in the valley resonated like a flute, and when the sun rose, the stained glass window was discovered to be missing, not shattered or stolen, but vanished entire, lead cames and all, leaving only a rectangular wound through which the morning light entered without color, falling upon the pews like a verdict. The bricks that had been stacked upon the grass were found toppled, each one cracked clean through, and the fragments smelled faintly of incense and of the sour milk that collects at the corners of an infant's mouth. Deacon Hale, whose beard had whitened overnight, as though the frost had leached pigment the way ash leaches lye, walked the perimeter at dawn and found, in the soft earth beneath the missing window, the tracks of small bare feet leading away toward the river. But the stride was wrong. The prints placed heel to heel as if the walker had been measuring a grave, and between each print lay a single tooth, spaced at intervals so regular that they might have been laid out by a sexton who understood the liturgy of loss. He followed the trail until it reached the ice-slicked stones of the Wallkill, where the footprints ended, but the teeth continued, bobbing away upon the dark water like a rosary whose string has broken. And though he waded in up to his thighs, the cold bit at his bones so viciously that he felt his own molars loosen, and he turned back, carrying in his pocket the one incisor he had managed to retrieve, a thing so small that it might have passed for a grain of rice. Had rice possessed the power to make a grown man taste, at the back of his throat, the ghost of every lullaby he had ever hummed, that spring the valley planted anyway, because hunger is less negotiable than dread, The seed corn went into the ground accompanied by the usual prayers, but the minister noticed that when the elders bowed their heads, their lips drew back in identical grimaces, as though some invisible finger had hooked their cheeks from within, and he understood that the building had not been emptied, but had merely relocated its center, the way a vortex shifts when the river changes course. He began to dream of a nursery that occupied the same spatial coordinates as the meeting house, but existed one octave lower, a place where cradles were fashioned from window leads, and the mobile that turned above them was made of teeth strung on red thread, rotating with the lazy precision of a butcher's scale weighing out hearts. His wife, whose lungs had grown more transparent with each hemorrhage, now spat blood that contained specks of what might have been Denton, and when he helped her to the mirror, she smiled at her reflection with a mouth already half collapsed, the gaps black as keyholes, and whispered that she could hear singing from the southeast corner of the manse, a lullaby in Dutch that she did not know she knew. He held her until the tremor passed, then walked out into the moonlit yard and saw, silhouetted against the white clapboard, the shadow of a creature that might have been a lamb if lambs walked upright. And the shadow was not cast by any solid body, but seemed to have been painted directly upon the paint, a fresco that breathed. By midsummer, the valley's dogs had learned to avoid the meeting house, slinking across the common with tails docked between legs, and the swallows that once nested beneath the eaves abandoned their mud-daubed cups, so that the silence of the nave was no longer merely absence, but a positive quality, the hush of a mouth that has forgotten the shape of its own name. Yet on the first Sunday of August, when the minister entered to prepare the table for communion, he found the floor strewn with rose petals that had been dried and then rehydrated so that they lay upon the pine like fragments of tongues, and at the eastern end someone had arranged the teeth, hundreds now, far more than the valley could have supplied, in the outline of a shepherd's crook, the curve so precise that it might have been drafted by a navigator who understood that the shortest distance between 2 points is not a straight line, but the arc of a story that begins with birth and ends with the extraction of every word the mouth once hoped to speak. The summer refused to die properly. By rights, the night should have cooled, the heavy air should have slipped away down the valley like a guilty guest, but instead it lingered, thick as wool soaked in lard, pressing against the clapboards until the very hinges sweated. On the first Monday of September, the day the county newspaper would later call the hottest apocalypse of the decade, the meeting house door was found standing open at dawn, though the deacon had locked it himself the night before and slipped the key, as always, into the pocket of the coat he kept hanging on the same peg his mother had used before him. The key was still there, cold as a sliver of moon, yet the door yawned wide upon a darkness that seemed to drink the early light, and the threshold was strewn with what looked at first glance like a spill of rice. Only when the sun climbed high enough to strike the floorboards did the grains resolve into teeth, ranked so tightly that no plank showed between them, each crown touching its neighbor in the way of mosaic tiles, and every root tip pointing inward, as though the nave itself had become a mouth preparing to pronounce a word older than the language it had been given. Deacon Hale stepped inside alone. The air tasted of iron struck by flint, a metallic tang that settled on the tongue and would not be swallowed. He had meant only to fetch the ledger in which he recorded the quarterly contributions, but the sight of the floor arrested him midway to the vestry, and he found himself kneeling without remembering the descent of his knees. The teeth were warm. He confirmed this with the back of his hand, warm as bread just turned from the oven, and the warmth traveled up his wrist until he felt the pulse in his own jaw quicken, a rabbit throb just beneath the skin. When he lifted one molar, The tooth came away cleanly, bringing with it a filament of what might have been nerve, though it felt more like silk thread soaked in honey, and the cavity from which it had been taken closed at once, wood flowing like water so that no mark remained. In that instant he understood that the building was no longer merely storing the harvest of bone. It was digesting. Word traveled the valley faster than the telegraph wire that had been strung the previous year along the post road, and by 10 o'clock every household had sent a representative to stand in the dooryard and stare at the open mouth of the church. No one crossed the threshold. They spoke in murmurs pitched low enough to be masked by the cicadas, whose drone had not diminished with the season, but had grown shriller, as though the insects were attempting to drill their way out of their own husks. The blacksmith's daughter, now 13 and still missing 2 permanent teeth that had never erupted, stood apart from the others, her fingers worrying the empty sockets until the gums bled. She alone seemed unable to hear the cicadas. What she heard instead was a lullaby, the same Dutch fragment the minister's wife had mentioned, but to her it carried words. Slaap kindje slaap, de tanden komen scherp. Sleep, child, sleep. The teeth grow sharp. She repeated the line aloud, and the valley's dogs, gathered in a loose ring beyond the common, lifted their muzzles and howled until the sound curdled the milk in the cans, waiting for the afternoon train. Minister Slade arrived carrying his wife's shawl about his shoulders, though the morning was already sultry. He had not slept. The lullaby had walked the corridors of the manse all night, ascending and descending the staircase with the measured tread of a nurse carrying a lamp. When he saw the tessellated floor, he felt no surprise, only the dull recognition of a debt long accruing and now come due. He stepped inside, the teeth gritting beneath his boot soles with a noise like distant hail, and walked the aisle until he stood beneath the empty window. The outline of the lamb remained upon the wall, not as shadow but as absence, a silhouette cut from the very grain of the pine, and within that silhouette the boards were lighter, as though the sun had been kept from them for a century and they had forgotten how to age. He pressed his palm to the mark and felt a suction, gentle but insistent, the way a sleepy child draws at the breast. When he withdrew his hand, the lifeline across his palm had widened, the skin split to reveal a seam of pink tissue that looked oddly porous, like the pulp of a young tooth not yet calcified. The elders met that evening in the deacon's apple house, where the air was thick with the fermentation of windfalls bruised beyond saving. They spoke in practical terms, whether to sweep the teeth into barrels and sink them in the river, whether to burn the building and sow the ground with salt, whether to summon a Catholic priest from Kingston, though none of them held with popery. In the end, they did what prudent men always do. They postponed the decision until after the harvest, because the barns were half empty and the corn stood unpicked, and because the true horror of a nightmare is not the apparition itself, but the knowledge that dawn will arrive anyway, and with it, the chores. They assigned a watch instead. 2 men to remain in the meeting house each night, armed with oil lamps and the deacon's old squirrel rifle, though they admitted among themselves that a lead ball would be of little use against a wall that had already learned to eat. The first watch fell to the blacksmith and the cooper, men whose trades had taught them the value of measured blows. They lit the lamps, set the rifle across their knees, and waited. The teeth gave off a faint phosphorescence as the temperature dropped, a glow the color of moonlight reflected on bone china, and the shadows they cast were not of teeth, but of children. Small, translucent silhouettes that wavered whenever the flame guttered. Sometime after midnight, the cooper, a man famed for the straightness of his staves, observed that the outline of the lamb upon the wall had begun to swell, its fleece rising in slow undulation, as though a wind were blowing through the very grain of the pine. When he pointed this out to the blacksmith, the latter grunted and raised the lamp, and in the sudden brightness they saw that the teeth along the aisle had migrated a finger's breadth toward the center, so that the path they had cleared earlier was now half blocked again. The blacksmith knelt, meaning to push them back, but the instant his skin touched the enamel he felt a tug, not violent but seductive, the way a sleeper feels the bedclothes drawn away by an affectionate spouse. When he stood, his wedding ring was gone, the flesh of his finger shaved so cleanly that no blood came, only a band of white that would not regain its color for the rest of his life. They did not speak of it afterward, not even to each other, but when the relief watch arrived at dawn, they found the two men standing outside beneath the catalpa tree, the lamps extinguished and the rifle abandoned, both staring at the doorway as if waiting for someone they had once loved to emerge and explain everything. The teeth were gone from the aisle. Instead, they formed a single sentence across the plastered wall behind the pulpit, the words spelled in the even schoolroom hand of a child who has been taught to form letters by pressing a finger into a tray of sand. We were built into the wall so that the wall might learn to speak. The plaster was still damp, though the house had been closed for 2 days, and the moisture smelled of the fluid that leaks from a coffin when the seal fails and the groundwater rises. Minister Slade read the sentence aloud when the sun was fully up, his voice steady only because he had already decided that astonishment was a luxury he could no longer afford. The congregation gathered in the yard, hats in hand, faces blank with the expression of people who have been told their own fortune and found it written in a language they cannot quite decipher. He asked for volunteers to help him dismantle the southeast corner stone by stone, so that whatever had been interred beneath might at last be exposed to daylight and, if necessary, to the cleansing violence of fire. No one stepped forward. Instead, the blacksmith's daughter walked past them all, entered the nave, and placed her mouth against the plaster directly over the final word. When she stepped away, her lips were printed in blood, but the sentence remained, each tooth-shaped letter intact, as though the wall had already absorbed what she had tried to retract. She turned to the assembly, opened her own mouth, and smiled, a smile wider than any child's face should allow, the corners extending almost to the lobes of her ears, revealing rows of teeth that were no longer hers alone, some too broad, some too sharp, some translucent as fingernails, all fitting together with the precision of a key entering a lock that has waited centuries to turn. That night the valley's dogs did not howl. They whined, a low, continuous sound that rose and fell with the cadence of breathing. In every barn the cows refused to come in for milking, standing instead, with their udders pressed against the rails, eyes white with terror. The minister sat at his desk attempting to compose a letter to the synod, but the ink separated in the well, the pigment settling into a layer the exact color of dried blood, while the clear fluid rose to the top, and when he dipped the pen, the words that emerged were not the ones he had intended. The wall is teething. The harvest will be mouths. He burned the page in the lamp, but the odor lingered, sweet and metallic, and he understood that the sentence had not been written to him, but through him, the way a child learns to speak by moving the adult tongue it has borrowed. Across the valley, women woke to find their own children standing at the foot of the bed, eyes open but unseeing, small hands working the air as if turning an invisible crank. From their parted lips came the same clicking heard months earlier in the meetinghouse, only now it was softer, intimate, the sound of a latch being tested in the dark. No one prevented them from walking out the doors. By morning, a procession moved along the post road. Boys and girls between the ages of 5 and 12, barefoot, though the dust was cold, each child's face lit by an inner pallor that made their features appear to float above their skulls. They did not speak, but their mouths worked, and every few steps one would bend to place a tooth upon the ground, spacing them with the same measured interval the deacon had observed in the river. At the head of the column walked the blacksmith's daughter, her hair unbraided and lifting in a wind that touched nothing else, and when she reached the meeting house she turned, faced the others, and opened her arms. The children entered single file, knelt, and pressed their offerings into the floorboards, which received them the way fresh pine receives a nail, with a sigh, and the slow closing of grain around the intruder. When the last tooth had been surrendered, the door swung shut of its own accord, and the valley fell silent except for the sound of breathing, many small lungs inhaling in perfect synchrony, the rhythm of a single organism learning to use the 1,000 mouths it had been given. The breathing lasted 3 days. On the 4th morning, the door stood open again, the nave empty, the floorboards seamless as if no tooth had ever been planted. Only the blacksmith's daughter remained inside, seated upright in the front pew, her mouth closed, her smile gone, her face so calm it might have been carved from the same pine as the walls. When they lifted her, they found she weighed nothing. Less than nothing, the men swore, the way a husk weighs less than the seed it once contained. Beneath her tongue lay a single molar, adult, root bifurcated like a devil's hoof, warm as fresh bread. They buried her in the southeast corner, under the original foundation stone the elders had cracked in 1759. The earth accepted her without complaint, the way a mouth accepts a word it has already swallowed. The meeting house still stands. Services continue, though the hymns are sung an octave lower, in a key that makes the rafters tremble like aging cartilage. The stained glass window was never replaced. The aperture is bricked up, but on certain nights, always the hottest, when the wind forgets to move, a rectangle of pale light appears on the interior wall, the silhouette of a lamb that walks upright, carrying across its shoulders not a sheep, but a child whose mouth is open, endless, feeding. Visitors who place an ear to the southeast corner report a faint, rhythmic click, the sound of something counting, slowly, patiently, the way a mother counts the teeth of a child she already knows she will outlive. No teeth have been found since, but every autumn the valley's children lose, one by one, the final molars meant to last a lifetime, and the dentist in Kingston, when he extracts the stumps, finds the roots ringed with cedar shavings, smelling faintly of rye and of exile. The teeth are never kept. They are wrapped in linen and buried beneath the hearth, because the elders have taught that a house which contains its own dead will never be taken by strangers. Last week the minister, no longer Slade but a younger man whose name no one remembers, stood in the pulpit and opened the great Bible to preach on the resurrection of the body. The page was already marked, a single verse underlined in ink the color of dried blood. "All thy walls are continually before me." He read it aloud, closed the book, and saw that the congregation had turned as one to face the bricked-up window. Their mouths were open, black, patient. No hymn was sung. When the last amen faded, the bricks began to sweat slowly, steadily, weeping tiny white grains that clicked as they fell, a sound like children's teeth settling into the grain of the wood, learning at last to speak the wall's slow, unfinishable sentence.